Hello and welcome to the Music Theory Guy clinic with me, Music Theory Guy. If you've got a question about music theory, this is the place to get it answered. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me an email or you can contact me via Facebook or Twitter. Now that's precisely what Bridie Fitzgerald has done, and I really do hope that I've pronounced your name correctly. She's written to me and she wants to know about stems. So I've put together this short video that explains a little bit about stems, such as their direction and how they work with other notes around them in a bar or a measure. So let's have a look. Okay, so before we get going, let's just be absolutely certain we know which part of a note we're referring to when we call or we say a stem. So here's a very typical looking note, and you might know this as a crotchet or a quarter note. Now this little black blob at the bottom, and sometimes it can be a white blob, that's known as the note head. This long line is the stem, and sometimes on notes you get this little funny thing sticking out from it. This is the tail, otherwise known as the flag. Now in this video I'm going to refer to it as a tail. So there's three sections of a note that you need to be aware of, and in this video we're focusing on the stem. And I'll put that little bit of information in the top right hand corner of the screen. The stem is always on the right when the note head is at the bottom, whereas the stem is always on the left when the note head is at the top. Now I'll give a few examples of when it's at the top and when it's at the bottom in a few moments, but just be aware that the tail always appears on the right of the stem, even when the note head is at the bottom or when the note head is at the top. Now again, I'll put this information on the right hand side of the screen so you can always refer to that whenever you need to. Now the big question is, when do you have a stem pointing up or pointing down? Now on every stave or staff there are 5 lines, and it's that middle line that helps you make that decision. I've highlighted that middle line red. Now in this example I've got a treble clef, but this is absolutely relevant to the bass clef, the alto clef, or even the tenor clef. It's that middle line where you make the decision on the stem direction. So when a note head is attached to that middle line, the stem can point up or it can point downwards. It's totally your call. But when the note head is below that middle line, the stem always points upwards, and when the note head is above that middle line, the stem always points downwards. Now I'm referring to this as a general rule of thumb. In other words, there are occasions where you can break that rule. Let's have a look at a couple of situations. Here are 3 notes. Now they're all sitting below that middle line, so their stems are pointing upwards. But imagine we want to put a note on this line. Now we could, as we've just discovered, have a stem pointing downwards or upwards, but it just visually makes sense if the stem on this occasion points upwards. So that's how we choose the direction of the stem in this example. Have a look at this example though. The first 2 notes, their note heads are below that middle line, so their stems obviously point upwards. The third note head is attached to the middle line, so that stem I've decided to point upwards. But the fourth note, now its note head is above that middle line. Now technically the stem should point downwards, but I would never have a problem if any of my students put the stem pointing upwards. It's often easier to read music when all of the stems are pointing in the same direction. So that's why I say it's a general rule of thumb. Sometimes you can just tweak and break that rule very, very slightly. So if in doubt, stick to that general rule of thumb, but sometimes you might find there's ways to break it. Now there are other exceptions. Have a look at this bar or measure. The 4 notes at the top, all of their note heads are above that middle line, but yet the stems are all pointing upwards, whereas the 3 notes at the bottom, their stems are pointing downwards. This is what we call multi-staff or multi-stave usage. In other words, there are 2 instruments sharing the same stave or staff. Now it could be that there are 2 singers. There's a soprano, that's a high female voice, she's singing those notes with the stems pointing upwards, or an alto, she would be singing the notes with the stems pointing downwards. If there are 2 instruments sharing those 5 lines, you're going to find that all the stems pointing upwards are for one instrument and all the stems pointing down are for another instrument. Now there can be some complications with this multi-staff usage. Have a look at this. And we're going to go through each note one by one, and we're going to imagine that there are 2 flutes playing. Flute 1 is only going to play the notes where the stems are pointing upwards. Flute 2 is only going to play the notes where the stems are pointing downwards. So in this first note, the E, that's going to be played by flute 1, whereas the A is going to be played by flute 2 because of the direction of the stems. The next note is a D. It's going to be played by flute 1 because the stem's pointing upwards. At this point, the flute 2 is still playing the A because that was a 2-beat note that they're playing. Now, this note, which I've highlighted red, there's a stem pointing upwards and downwards. That means that both flute 1 and flute 2 are going to play the note B. Now, this note here, which I've highlighted red, it's a B again. Who's going to play it? Well, it's going to be flute 2 because that stem is pointing downwards. Don't be fooled by the fact that the note head is higher than the note next to it. Because the stem is pointing downwards, it will be flute 2 that plays that note. So the A, because the stem is pointing upwards, that's going to be played by flute 1. Just one final exception before we end. Here's the note D. And next to it, I've popped a grace note, otherwise known as an acciaccatura. Now at this point, I need to make an apology. The last time I talked about acciaccaturas, and please do go and have a look at my clinic video on acciaccaturas, I received lots of messages about my inability as a British person to pronounce that correctly. I know I offended lots of Italians. My apologies. I'm really sorry. I don't know what to do about it. I will go away and practice, I promise you. But for the moment, a grace note or an acciaccatura, its stem always points upwards regardless of its position on the staff or the stave. Okay, so on the right of the screen, we've been through and we've got all of the rules that you need to know about directions and the use of stems. Okay, well I hope that's been useful to you, Bridie, and anybody else that's been watching. If any of you have any questions about music theory, please do send me an email or contact me via Facebook or Twitter. I really do look forward to receiving your messages. In the meantime, many thanks for watching, and if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe to my channel on YouTube. In the meantime, many that's been watching. Remember, if anybody else that's been watching, please do send. Batteries are running out. Oh. Stop it. Think. Okay.